It started on an ordinary evening, the kind that doesn't promise anything new, but somehow changes everything. The air outside was cool, soft with the smell of rain, and the streets shimmered faintly under the dim, orange glow of the lamps. I had stopped by my friend's house to return a borrowed book, nothing more. But when the door opened, it wasn't him who stood there, it was her. She had that effortless kind of presence, the kind that didn't need words to be noticed. A 40-year-old woman with long black hair, cascading loosely over her shoulders, wearing a light sweater that matched the calm warmth in her eyes. Her smile was small but sincere, the kind that seemed to pull you in without trying. I remember the way her laugh lines deepened slightly when she smiled, the quiet confidence in her posture, the graceful way she leaned against the doorframe, as if she had all the time in the world. She recognized me instantly, her voice soft but teasing. "He's not home yet. You can wait if you want." It should have been a simple offer, but something in her tone carried warmth that felt personal. I hesitated, then nodded, stepping inside. The house smelled faintly of vanilla and old books, the kind of scent that feels lived in, familiar, almost comforting. We sat in the living room, and the silence between us wasn't awkward. It was steady, like two people quietly aware of each other's presence. She asked about college, about life, about things that no one really asks unless they mean it. Her questions weren't small talk. They were gentle openings, small doorways to deeper things. And as I spoke, I caught myself watching the way she listened, fully, intently, like each word mattered. When she laughed, she'd touch her hair lightly, and for some reason, that small gesture drew me in more than anything else. There was nothing forced about her. No pretense, no attempt to impress. Just grace, natural, grounded, real. At one point, she leaned forward to pour me some tea. Her hand brushed mine, not by intention, just a fleeting touch, but the warmth lingered long after. My heartbeat quickened, and I tried to steady my breathing. It wasn't attraction in the loud, impulsive sense. It was quieter, heavier, the kind that stays under your skin. Before I left that night, she smiled again. That same knowing smile, soft but unguarded. "You're always welcome here," she said. Simple words, yet they carried a weight I couldn't name. And as I walked away, I couldn't shake the thought that something had shifted, not just between us, but inside me, like the first spark of a feeling that shouldn't exist but refuses to be ignored. That night, her smile stayed with me. And somehow, I knew this wasn't the last time I'd find myself standing at her door. A week passed before I saw her again, though her face had lingered in my thoughts every night since. My friend had invited me over to help with something in the garage, but when I arrived, he'd gone out to run errands. She was there, though, standing by the open kitchen window, her hair pulled back loosely, sunlight tracing soft lines across her face. She turned when she heard the door, her lips curving into that same easy smile. "He just stepped out," she said. "You can wait here if you'd like." There was no reason to say no, but something inside me hesitated anyway. That quiet tug between wanting to be near her and not knowing what that meant anymore. Still, I stepped inside. The kitchen felt alive in the afternoon light, bright, warm, with the scent of coffee and something sweet baking in the oven. She moved gracefully, barefoot, humming under her breath as she poured tea into 2 cups. There was no effort in the way she filled the space. She simply belonged there, effortlessly elegant, calm, but full of life. We talked about simple things at first. Work, weather, the little frustrations of daily life. But the more she spoke, the more I realized how much she carried behind that composed smile. She talked about how quiet the house had become lately, how time felt slower, how her son barely spoke these days. There was no complaint in her tone, just honesty. I listened, but every word seemed to pull me closer, not through pity, but through something deeper, empathy, maybe, or recognition. I told her about my own restlessness, about feeling caught between what's expected and what's real. She looked at me then, and in her eyes, there was that soft kind of understanding that words can't fake. At some point, she leaned closer across the counter to hand me a cookie from the tray. Our fingers touched again, just a small electric moment. Her eyes flickered briefly to our hands, then back to mine, and the silence that followed was louder than any conversation we'd had. I could feel the warmth of her so close, the faint scent of her perfume, the quiet rhythm of her breathing. It wasn't desire that filled the air, it was tension wrapped in care, the kind that asks for permission without saying a word. She smiled then, a little softer this time. "You always seem so thoughtful," she murmured, as if she could see straight through the mask I didn't know I was wearing. For a second, the world outside didn't exist. The light, the scent, the stillness, all of it blurred around her. Then the front door creaked. My friend's voice echoed faintly down the hall. She pulled her hand back quickly, her face settling into calm composure. But her eyes, they lingered, and in them, I saw the truth neither of us dared to speak. Something had begun, quietly, beneath the surface. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither of us planned. I started finding excuses to stop by, a book to return, a message to pass along, a question that could have easily been a text. Each time, I told myself it was nothing. But the moment I saw her, standing by the window or tending to the plants in the yard, that illusion broke like fragile glass. She greeted me the same way every time, warm, poised, but with that small flicker in her eyes that made everything else fade. The house, once just another place, began to feel like its own world. Afternoons, they were slower, quieter, filled with the kind of peace that feels dangerous when you start to depend on it. One Sunday, she was painting in the living room when I dropped by. A canvas leaned against the wall, strokes of blue and white still wet under the light. She looked up, brushing a stray strand of hair behind her ear. "You caught me," she said, smiling. "It's my therapy." I laughed softly, stepping closer. "It suits you." Her cheeks warmed slightly, but she didn't look away. "You think so?" I nodded, and for a moment, she just stood there, brush still in hand, watching me like she wanted to say something but decided not to. Then, almost without thinking, she asked, "Would you help me?" I hesitated. "With painting?" "Just hold the canvas steady," she said, smiling faintly. I agreed, moving beside her. The air smelled faintly of paint and citrus. I held the edge of the frame while she worked, her arm brushing against mine every so often. Each touch was fleeting, innocent, but my pulse quickened all the same. I could hear the faint sound of her breath, calm and rhythmic, but every now and then it caught slightly, as if she felt it too. When she leaned in to adjust a line, her shoulder brushed my chest. She froze for a heartbeat, then continued painting, her voice low and steady. "You're very patient," she said softly. "It's easy to be," I murmured, "when it feels right." Her brush slowed. The words hung there, suspended between us. She didn't respond, but her eyes lifted, meeting mine, lingering just long enough to make my throat tighten. The clock ticked faintly in the background. Outside, birds called in the distance. Inside, everything felt still. When the painting was done, she set the brush down and took a step back. "Thank you," she said quietly, though it felt like she meant something more. As I turned to leave, she stopped me at the door. "You know," she said, "you don't have to find excuses to visit." Her tone was gentle, but her gaze was steady, a quiet permission or maybe a warning. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that her voice stayed with me long after I left. Soft, certain, and impossible to forget. The sky broke open that evening without warning. Sheets of rain against the windows, thunder rolling softly in the distance. I'd stopped by again, bringing back the umbrella I'd borrowed the week before. My friend wasn't home, and I told myself I'd just drop it off and go. But when she opened the door, hair loosely tied, wearing a soft gray cardigan that seemed made for rainy days, the world outside blurred into nothing. "You'll get soaked if you leave now," she said, glancing past me at the storm. "Stay until it eases." It wasn't a question. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a quiet click. The house felt different in the rain, dimmer, warmer. The scent of freshly brewed tea filled the air, and somewhere in the background, an old record played low, its melody soft and nostalgic. She moved toward the kitchen, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. "You like honey in your tea, right?" I nodded. watching as she poured 2 cups. Her movements were slow, deliberate, every gesture graceful in its simplicity. When she handed me the cup, our fingers brushed again, and though I'd grown used to those moments, this one felt heavier. We sat near the window, watching the rain slide down the glass in crooked lines. The silence was steady, peaceful, but underneath it, something unspoken pulsed. "Do you ever feel," she began, her voice barely above the rain, "like you're standing still while everyone else moves on?" Her tone wasn't sad. It was reflective, vulnerable. I turned to her, noticing the faint shadows beneath her eyes, the quiet tiredness behind her composure. "Sometimes," I said, "more often than I'd like to admit." She smiled faintly, her gaze distant. "I thought I'd have it all figured out by now. But life," she trailed off, letting the thought dissolve into the sound of rain. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The warmth from her shoulder brushed against mine, and I didn't move. The storm outside softened the world, made everything else feel small. Then, almost absent-mindedly, she reached out, her hand resting lightly on mine. Not searching, not asking, just there. Her touch was warm, steady. I looked at our hands, then at her. Her eyes met mine, calm but unreadable. "Sometimes," she said softly, "you just need someone to listen." I nodded, though the air between us said more than either of us dared. My pulse was uneven, the world around us dim except for the gentle glow of the lamp. When the rain finally began to fade, neither of us moved to stand. The world outside had changed. The air smelled clean, the streets shimmered, but inside, something else had shifted too. As I finally rose to leave, she walked me to the door. The sound of rain still lingered faintly on the roof. She smiled, quiet and knowing. "You'll catch a cold if you don't take care," she said, handing me my umbrella. I took it, and for a second, our fingers lingered longer than they should have. After that night, the air between us felt different, not colder, not awkward, just charged with something neither of us wanted to name. The next few days passed quietly. I didn't visit, though I thought about it every morning. Every time I walked past her street, I caught myself slowing down, glancing at her window, wondering if she was thinking about that touch the same way I was. When I finally did see her again, it was at the local bookstore. She was standing by the window, reading the back of a novel, her hair falling softly over her shoulder. The late afternoon light painted her in a golden haze, and for a moment, I simply watched, not wanting to break whatever peace she'd found in that stillness. She noticed me eventually, her lips curving into that familiar smile. "I was starting to think you'd forgotten about us," she said lightly. "Never," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just busy." She tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly, the kind of look that sees through excuses. But she didn't press. Instead, she closed the book and said, "Walk with me." We walked along the narrow streets behind the shop, the kind lined with old trees and soft, uneven sunlight. Our hands brushed a few times by accident maybe, but neither of us moved away. There was comfort in that closeness, an unspoken acknowledgement that something fragile was forming, something both of us were too careful to name. At one point, she stopped to fix her hair as the wind blew it across her face. I reached out without thinking, tucking a loose strand behind her ear. The gesture was simple, but the way she looked at me afterward, her lips parted slightly, her eyes soft but uncertain, made my heart thud harder than it should have. She exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't be this kind," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because people might start to misunderstand." Her words lingered, sharp yet tender. I want to tell her I didn't care what people thought, that this, whatever it was, felt real. But I stayed silent. Sometimes silence is the only way to keep something from breaking. We sat later on a bench beneath a row of fading maple leaves. She told me about her past, the years that had tested her, the choices she'd made, the loneliness she'd learned to carry quietly. I listened, feeling every word like a weight pressed gently against my chest. When the sky began to turn orange, she stood. "You should go before it gets dark," she said, her voice steady again. I nodded, though my feet didn't move right away. As I turned to leave, she called after me softly, "You're kind, but careful, that's rare. Her words weren't a confession, but they felt like one. And as I walked away, the space between us felt wider than ever, filled with everything we wanted to say but couldn't. The next few weeks passed in quiet patterns. Every few days, there'd be a text, a brief call, or an accidental encounter that didn't feel accidental at all. We never spoke about what was happening. Maybe because putting it in a word would make it too real, or maybe because neither of us knew what name it deserved. It was a Saturday afternoon when I found myself at her doorstep again. My friend had gone out of town, and I told myself I was just checking in. She opened the door before I even knocked twice, as if she'd been expecting me. "You look like you haven't eaten," she said with a faint smile. "Come." The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. Sunlight streamed through the curtains, casting soft patterns across the wooden floor. She wore a simple blue dress, nothing extravagant, but the kind of dress that carried a quiet charm. Her hair was tied loosely, a few strands framing her face in a way that made her seem effortlessly beautiful. We sat in the kitchen, the same place where everything had started. She poured coffee into 2 mugs and slid one toward me. Our fingers brushed again, and the familiar warmth of her touch stirred something deep inside me, a mix of longing and restraint. For a while, we talked about simple things, her garden, my work, the book she'd been reading. But beneath every word was a silence that said more than the conversation itself. Her laughter came easily, but there was a softness to it now, a carefulness, like she was guarding something fragile. At one point, I noticed her staring out the window, lost in thought. "You've been quieter lately," I said. She turned to me, her expression thoughtful. "Sometimes it's easier not to say everything you feel," she murmured. "Once you speak it, you can't take it back." Her words hit deeper than I expected. I wanted to tell her that I understood, that silence had become my language too, the only way to keep from crossing a line neither of us was ready to admit existed. She looked at me then, really looked, the kind of gaze that holds you still. "You make it hard to forget how it feels to be seen," she said quietly. I didn't know how to respond. My throat tightened, my chest heavy with everything I couldn't say. The air between us felt thick with emotion, the kind that demanded honesty but feared the consequence of it. The clock ticked in the background. Outside, the wind stirred the leaves. Inside, the only sound was the faint clink of her spoon against the mug. Then, without a word, she reached across the table and placed her hand over mine. It wasn't bold. It was gentle, steady, full of quiet meaning. "No promises, no explanations, just presence." And in that stillness, I realized sometimes love doesn't ask to be declared. It just wants to be understood. It happens slowly, like the way seasons change, one day blending into the next until you suddenly realize the world feels different. I hadn't seen her in over a week. My friend was back. Life had resumed its usual rhythm. And yet every day carried the echo of her voice, the quiet warmth of her presence. The space between us had become an ache, gentle, constant, unspoken. Then one evening, she called. Her voice was calm, steady, but I could hear something beneath it, a softness that sounded almost like farewell. "Can you come by?" she asked. When I arrived, the sun was already low, its last light spilling through the windows in golden streaks. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. She was standing near the window, her long black hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a simple cream blouse and jeans. The light caught in her eyes as she turned toward me, warm but distant. "I wanted to see you," she said, "before things get too busy again." I didn't ask what she meant. I just nodded, stepping closer. The air between us was full of everything we hadn't said, the moments that had stretched too long, the touches that had lingered too much, the silence that had held too many truths. She gestured toward the table. "2 cups of tea, already poured. You still take honey, right?" I smiled faintly. "Always." We sat facing each other the way we had so many times before, but tonight felt different. There was a quiet finality in the air, like both of us already knew this would be the last time. After a while, she spoke. "You remind me of the part of myself I forgot existed," she said softly. The part that believed in quiet things, kindness, patience, being seen for who you are. Her words were simple, but they struck something deep inside me. And you, I said, remind me that not everything beautiful has to last forever to matter. Her eyes glistened for a moment, not from sadness exactly, but from the weight of knowing. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing mine. The same touch we'd shared countless times before, but this one felt different, slower, deliberate, full of both gratitude and restraint. "You'll do well," she whispered. "You already have what people spend years searching for, heart." The words lingered in the air, warm and heavy. I wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. Instead, I just held her gaze, memorizing every detail. The faint smile lines near her eyes, the way her hair caught the light, the calm grace she carried even in goodbye. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. For a moment, we both hesitated. Then, gently, she stepped closer and rested her hand against my cheek, a touch that said more than any confession could. "Take care," she murmured. And just like that, it was over. No promises, no regrets, just the quiet echo of something rare, something that had lived softly between two hearts and ended exactly as it began, with a smile.